Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 8, Day 2. Today's topic on your journal is going to be what were some of the biggest issues that immigrants are dealing with in the late 19th century. So we spent a lot of time in Day 1 talking about immigration, talking about city life, and we're going to pick up with talking a little bit more about some of those things today. But we're going to talk mostly about reform and education, all right? And we're going to try to start moving through some of the various things going on during the Progressive Era. Now, our central question for the day is, what was the effect of the women's movement and education on the United States in the end of the 19th and early 20th century? All right, and there's a lot of things going on for women during this time, but there's also a lot going on for education. There's a lot in reforms of just how things are being pushed forward in regards to elections and various people. And that kind of brings us to our first topic that we're going to talk about with reforms. Nativism was a huge movement during this time, and the idea is that nativists are focused on America as a whole. So they look at those people who are here who we should be taking care of, and we should limit those who are coming in. And as a result, between 1850 and the 1880s, nativism really reappeared, and we already talked a little bit about that with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Many of your upper-class nativists joined this new group called the Immigration Restriction League. And what happened was this league wanted to exclude unfit immigrants by forcing them to pass literacy tests. And literacy tests we'll talk more about, but literacy tests were these just ridiculously hard tests that tested your ability to read and comprehend, and a lot of times they were very unfair because even if you could read and comprehend, you couldn't answer the questions. But generally this was to limit Southern and Eastern European immigrants who are much different from those people who are already here. Another reform going on during this time was Prohibition, and you're going to see Prohibition really pushed from about the 1860s on by women, and women kind of try to tie suffrage along with temperance, because what happens here is women have their kind of political future tied to African Americans and their freedom with slavery. And then when African Americans are freed and nothing happens for women, then they had to find a new cause to tie to women's suffrage to try to show that they were politically active and that they were involved in changing society. Now, three of the main organizations that were against Prohibition, or that were for Prohibition, were the Prohibition Party in 1869, the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874, and the Anti-Saloon League in 1893. And all of these groups opposed drinking on the grounds that it led to terrible personal tragedies. All right, and we talked a little bit about temperance movements and whatnot in American History 1 and in those earlier units. And remember, Prohibition is the you cannot sell or distribute alcohol. Okay, it doesn't say you can't drink it. It just says you can't sell or distribute it. Okay, and then temperance is limiting the amount of alcohol that is being consumed. And so those are the two ideas being pushed. And many people, including women, saw links between these saloons, immigrants, and political bosses. And if you remember, we talked a lot about those political bosses in Tammany Hall and how they're influencing politics. Well, these saloons bring together immigrants and political bosses who use the immigrants to accomplish their goals. Now, the Purity Crusaders were formed in 1873. Anthony Comstock founded this society, and it was trying to suppress vice. And vice is something that you struggle with. So maybe like alcohol would be a vice for some adults. Cigarettes may be a vice. Soft drinks. I mean, there are all sorts of vices that people have in their lives, but it's just something that you can't almost live without, but it kind of hinders your life. But vice had become very visible and profitable in urban areas, so they were making lots of money off of alcohol and these saloons and things of that nature. And Anthony Comstock helped win passage of a law that prohibited sending any materials deemed obscene through the U.S. mail. And so like things such as like information about birth control or, something like advertising alcohol or maybe it's graphic material of a particular nature. But regardless, he was very involved in trying to help with people be quote-unquote pure. And he also fought to end police corruption in cities. All right, so these police who are getting kickbacks from big businesses. Now, the social gospel movement starts in about 1890, and this is another one of those reform movements that we're talking about here. And it sought to apply the gospel of Jesus to society directly, that essentially you should go out into society and you should help people, and you should try to do the same principle. You should try to apply the principles that Jesus applied in the Bible to those who are in your community. And so what happens is these urban churches in the 1880s and 1890s, they began providing services for the poor, and they try to focus on the unfortunate circumstances that drove these people to their vices, all right, and these immigrants and other people, and trying to help them by showing them grace and mercy. Now, you also had the Federal Council of Churches of Christ in 1908 that formed, and they're going to kind of continue this social gospel movement in supporting better living conditions for people, trying to promote a larger share in the national wealth for all workers. And they're going to try to promote these things for your normal working class people and immigrants. And you're going to see as time goes that a lot of other denominations in churches adopt this social gospel theory. And it's kind of become a popular thing that people expect the church to help them, or that the church aids people when they're in need. That's kind of this movement. That's kind of what pushes, that's the idea of the church now. The settlement movement was another reform movement taking place during this time, and it educated women and put men and put the social gospel into practice. And so the settlement movement, people would live in these people who lived in these poor neighborhoods would be able to come to these settlement houses and various things that they created in order to help these people. And the other thing that happened is those who were involved in the settlement movement would actually live in these poor neighborhoods, and they would witness poverty firsthand. And then they would create communities around these impoverished areas and try to fix it, or at least help the people. And two of those who were very important in that were Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, who created the Hull House. And what happened was they had went on a trip to London and seen the settlement movement kind of in action in London. And so they buy this mansion in Chicago, fix it up, and they open their doors to immigrants. And what happens is people would work there, and people would donate money to the Hull House, and people who worked there would actually get their room and board for working there. So basically, for being an employee there, for maybe it's cleaning rooms, doing laundry, whatever, you could keep your room and board, and they would sometimes give you low wages. But by 1910, more than 400 settlement houses existed, and these were just places to help the poorer people of your community. Now, you also had education being pushed during this time. There were new laws beginning to limit child labor, which forced children back into the school system, which it helped. But the problem here is there wasn't a whole lot of enforcement, and there's still a lot of businesses trying to skirt around child labor laws. But the purpose of schools really turned into promoting American standards of cleanliness, thrift, patriotism, hard work, and trying to promote to immigrants assimilation, and trying to be more like quote-unquote Americans. And you're going to see even here a very uneven support of school funding, specifically white and black schools, and a huge amount of segregation, which we'll talk more about as we go. African Americans were also getting involved into higher education. We talked about that a little bit in Unit 7. In 1890, only 160 African Americans were in white colleges. And by 1900, over 2,000 African Americans had graduated African American colleges. And this is very important because just in 10 years, you're starting to see more and more education for African Americans, and you're seeing the spread of education, how important it is. And that's only going to continue to grow throughout the next 30 and 40 years, especially with the First World War and World War II. It's going to really change some of the focus for African American rights and what happens, and we'll talk more about that. Booker T. Washington was one of the most famous African Americans who pushed education. He graduated Hampton Institute in Virginia, and his college experience inspired him to develop his own institute, which he did in Tuskegee, Alabama, creating the Tuskegee Institute. And he tried to teach African Americans to deal with prejudice and harsh reality of society. That was part of the institute, was this is how society is. It's not going to change immediately. You've got to learn how to deal with it. As a result, by 1895, Booker T. Washington was actually asked to consult Washington, like the government of Washington, D.C., on racial issues, and Teddy Roosevelt even invited him into the White House in 1901. Now, his counterpart to his arguments about African Americans was W.E.B. Du Bois. And Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were both advocates for African American rights. However, they both looked at it from different perspectives. Du Bois was born free in Massachusetts and had graduated as well from Tennessee Fisk University in 1895. And he disagreed with Washington's point of view and said that the best African Americans had to step forward and lead their people. Versus Washington was promoting that African Americans just kind of take a back seat and do the jobs that they need, that whites, quote unquote, needed them to do, and fill in order to gain acceptance. Like, you should gain acceptance first, then push for rights. And Du Bois said that no, you need to step forward and you need to be in the forefront of promoting African American rights, promoting that African Americans are equal to any other group. Now, Du Bois said this only when they had developed intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and the relation of men to it. He wrote, would they be equipped to lead, talking about the Negro race. And essentially, Du Bois is saying that until African Americans are showing that they are just as good as anybody else, they're never going to be pushing their rights forward. Now, here are your questions for today. Make sure you answer all 4 of these and put those at the bottom of your notes. And then finally, here are your 6 vocabulary words. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon.